The following is a presentation of the Matt Talk Podcast Network.
Welcome to another episode of the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. I am your host, Jason Bryant. Been around the world doing a bunch of things with wrestling in the world of broadcasting, journalism, and announcing the show. Today, very special episode. So if this is your first time listening, you might want to head back to other episodes where we've got interviews with certain stars in the sport of wrestling, notable names and topics, unique experiences. Today is a unique experience, but this is to mark the 10-year anniversary of the podcasting journey that I've been on. November 11th, 2008 was the first time I released a podcast about wrestling. It was called Wrestling 411. It was with a gentleman by the name of Kyle Klingman. We worked on this project together for the 2008-2009 college wrestling season, and the project ultimately failed. We were part of something that was trying to create a sports center for college wrestling, and it failed. It ran out of money, and Kyle and I were kind of left wondering what to do. It put a strain on our relationship for a little while, and today, this episode will kind of be a somewhat of a deep dive into that first year of podcasting, that first episode of Wrestling 411, why we both left our respective positions in wrestling to take a chance on this. And we don't really hold back a whole lot. There's some things there that it was a rough time for both of us in several different ways, and Kyle and I both talk about that. So if you've been listening to the Short Time Wrestling Podcast or anything on the Matt Talk Podcast Network for a number of years, this is how the journey in podcasting began. Didn't know exactly what the heck we were doing, kind of the blind leading the blind, but here's the deep dive. This is the story of Wrestling 411 here on the Short Time Wrestling Podcast. Enjoy. On November 11th, 2008, that is just over 10 years ago, the world changed as we knew it. Here today on the Short Time Wrestling Podcast, I am joined by Kyle Klingman, and we will talk about the lost year of wrestling with a company called Media Sports Productions and its underling Wrestling 411. Here on the Short Time Wrestling Podcast, we are celebrating 10 years of podcasting with what was started for both of us, Wrestling 411. Kyle had a show with On the Mat, which he still does today, prior to coming on board. And Kyle, it's been an interesting 10 years since we both came together up here in Minneapolis and tried to do something.
It has been interesting. You talked about it being 10 years since we both came to the Twin Cities for that project that was started by Jay Robinson, who was the head wrestling coach at the University of Minnesota. And as you bring it up, there's so many vivid memories for me. And as you approached me about this year, it's pretty remarkable how I can look back and just have kind of laser beam precision about things that happened, even though it wasn't a very good year for me. I really struggled during that 1 year from late 2008 until 2009. And as I look back to it, it really did set me up for where I am today. And a lot of the skills that I learned from that time I use today, and I'm grateful for it. But it doesn't mean that there weren't some real hardships that I had to go through during that year. So to be able to reminisce about it and make sense about it 9 years, 10 years after the fact, I think I'm pretty honored that we have this opportunity and this platform on Matt Talk Online.
Oh, what's also interesting is we've brought this up a couple times in the past, is that it's amazing that we're still friends after that year. And we will go into why, because, I'll be quite honest with you. I was in a different spot in my life, and ideals and perspectives were different. But I'm going to start with where I was at the time, and then I want you to go where you were, and then when we came together on this. So at the time, I get the call from, we know about Wrestling 411 that it's coming out. We hear that there's going to be this pilot episode running on what was then called CSTV. I remember going home from where I worked at the NWCA in Manheim, Pennsylvania. At the time, I was the director of media operations, and I was running the Intermat website, which was all the rankings. I mean, basically, it was a lot of work for what it was. And 10 years ago, we didn't even have social media from the 05, 08 era in which I was running it. So I ran home, and it didn't air that day. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Apparently there were some issues with the pilot not running. And then a couple weeks later, I get a call from Jay Robinson and Wade Chalice on my cell, and they start pitching me on, I'm the guy that they want to come and help lead this program, this Wrestling 411. And they were saying all the right things to me, because at the time, my career goals were always to be in sports broadcasting, to be, on television, to be the most recognizable broadcaster in sports history. Yeah, it's a little lofty goal, but they were saying all the right things to me. And I'm sitting there, and I just bought a house 8 months before I left. And I'm sitting there, I've got to decide on this. And I ultimately was thinking about it. And I was supposed to go to the COSIDA convention in Tampa in June. I figured, you know what, I'm going. That'll be the weekend. I've got no wrestling people around me. I can sit there. I can go by the pool. I can see what the level of sports is. Dick Vitale was speaking there at the convention that year. And I thought that was where I was going to make my decision. Well, wrestling doesn't really have many secrets. And before I even had a chance to get on that plane, the word had gotten out to my bosses from somebody connected with Wrestling 411 that I was going to take the job. And I hadn't even weighed all my options yet. And it was like, oh man. So I was kind of like, all right, well, I'm going to go down there, and they're expecting an answer when I come back. So ultimately I said, I'm going to leave my house behind. I'm going to rent it out, and I'm going to move to Minnesota. I had a friend of mine who lived here. I was actually at a bachelor party in Philly when I decided to do it, which was about 90 minutes from where I was at. And I said, my buddy Charlie's brother Joe lived in Arden Hills. I said, hey, Joe, I'm thinking about taking this gig. He goes, well, you got a place to stay here. So that was pretty much what sealed the deal. So that's how I got approached, and that's kind of the story about why I accepted it. So, how were you approached?
Well, mine was purely through Jay. So Wade Chalice, I didn't even, through this entire thing, had no idea he was really even involved, other than maybe one conference call we had later. So it was through a relationship with Jay. And I was really honored that Jay thought highly enough of me to include me in that. And putting it in context, this was really a tough spot in my life, because the Dan Gable International Wrestling Institute Museum, a very long name, which is now the National Wrestling Hall of Fame Dan Gable Museum, we had flooded in June of 2008. So we had these massive floods in the state of Iowa, which just wrecked the museum. So we were in disarray, and it really was good timing, because we really couldn't afford to have all the people we had on staff. And so Jay approached me about it. I wasn't sure about it. I can remember vividly where we had some temporary offices because the museum had just been completely destroyed. I took a walk down the block, and I thought, I'm going to call Jason and just ask him about what his thoughts are, because I'd been approached by Jay Robinson about the project. And so I called you, and you pretty much reiterated to me what you wanted to get out of it. And as you talked about the contrast and how we view the world, mine was different. I was just looking for another opportunity. I didn't really have that end game of saying, I want to be this, this, and this. I liked the job that I was in. I felt like it was a good lane for me, but this is a unique opportunity. Jay has a really magical way of pitching things so that you buy into it and you believe it. And so he gave me a great pitch. I talked to you. You seemed a little standoffish about it. I don't think you wanted to over disclose information to me, but you said, I want to be on TV, and that was your goal. And so I thought about it for a little bit, and I made the plunge, and I moved up to the Twin Cities and started with Wrestling 411, which I didn't know it was going to come to. I really didn't even know what I was going to do, to be honest with you. And throughout the course of it, as we continue this dialogue, I still don't know in some ways what the end game was supposed to be, but it was a very necessary move for me in my life, and I needed to make it. And as I said in the earlier part, it was a good experience, even though it was painful at times.
Yeah, and I remember that phone call because I was at Park City Center, which is the giant shopping mall in Lancaster. I was walking around, and I remember you called in, and just for some backstory, too, because Kyle and I really didn't know each other that well. We would trade emails about movies and various wrestling statistics through his role at the Gable Museum, and then mine with the NWC and Intermat. And we really didn't have this like long time friendship. We'd hung out a little bit at nationals, but at that point it was really win show type stuff, and I was doing coverage, so we really didn't pass each other in the same veins of wrestling very frequently. So when I sit there and I'm 20, I'm trying to think, what year was it? 2008. So I was turning 29, and I just bought a house. And let's see, where I was at was the proximity of my house to Clipper Magazine Stadium, which was a minor league baseball park, was literally a half a block. I mean, I would wake up in the morning, walk outside it was a row house. So I lived it was like the Cosby Show type of, you get the stoop, you get the stairs, and then there's a baseball stadium. And every day there would be a foul ball in my gutter. And, that was cool. And I was walking distance from two of my favorite haunts. I was announcing stuff for roller derby. I was actually set up to be the PA announcer for Franklin Marshall football that coming fall. And then, I sat there and I talked to my mom about it, talked to my dad about it. And, they had helped me buy the house a little bit and put some money down. I was like, I'm leaving everything I know to go to Minnesota, which I'd been to a couple times. It was a risk. It was absolutely a risk. And, in hindsight, with the house, I took a bath on the house, so I can get to that later. But it was like, all right, here we go. My 29th birthday, I spent at a Steak and Shake in West Lafayette, Indiana, with my mom and my friend Terry in a U-Haul, driving my stuff to Minnesota. So we got here, ended up moving in with Joe Bush, who is a friend of the program. My buddy, his brother Charlie's a buddy of mine, wrestled with us at Old Dominion. He's a police officer in St. Paul here now, back in Minnesota. So I had already a place to stay, and then there were already roommates there. So it was a house full of people, and then we tried to scope out where this office was. And the first day we drove around, I had the wrong Hennepin. So I was on the other side of Hennepin. I was more like deeper into Minneapolis than I was like literally 5 minutes away from where I actually lived. So location-wise, where I lived was almost perfect to find Jay's camp office. So I get here, August 20th is my birthday. I finally pull in the 21st, and I'm in Minnesota. So I'm here. I'm straight.
Yep. And you got there before I did. I came up a little bit later. My recollection is that I came up around October 1st of 2008 and then started in on what we were supposed to do. And I think you had done some stuff prior to me. I don't know if there was some conversations you had, but I was a little bit late in the game, and we just kind of felt our way through it into what we eventually did with 411. I think you were supposed to be doing a TV show, and that didn't materialize. I was supposed to, I guess, be the radio side, and then it turned into both of us doing the podcast, and then we did a version of that with a television show that was quote television show that was online, and we went from there. So I think from what I remember, the original vision was big time TV show, awesome radio show, and then it really had to morph into something else because the original vision didn't materialize. And we worked with a lady named Janie Lenz, who was the backbone behind it. She was the driving force, and I really liked Janie. I think for all of us, it was a tumultuous time, and maybe there was some hurt feelings and some different thoughts about people during that time, but she was a big part of that. So it was the three of us, and not really a lot of direction on where we're going to go. So we just kind of made things up, and we had our first edition of the podcast at KOG on the campus of Augsburg.
Yeah, we did. And as you said, I got there a little earlier. So that month of September, I was basically, they had given me the computers to figure out what the heck was going on. I'd walked into the camp office. So I had been in the office, that workspace right there on Hennepin where Jay's camp was, and he had some other stuff going out of there. He had whatever signs were on the wall were like Jay's old companies they were all in the same building. It was, I think that was actually where the wrestling mall was born there for a while too. But yeah, so in correct. September we got that. And then I was sitting there trying to learning how to do footage, like learning how to do, use Final Cut Pro to see how much of this stuff that we could edit the footage. And the idea was to send out, feelers to all these colleges, say, here's what we're going to do. Send us your tape, send us your video so we can include it on the show. And, if there were rights fees to deal with, we were going to pay for them. I actually talked with Austin Schanfalter the other day, who was one of the financial backers later on in the game. And, what he had pointed out was, he had a cable industry background. We were trying to do what we were trying to do legitimately, using, paying for footage and getting permission to use footage and coming up with what I always termed as a sports center of wrestling. And the idea, my title was actually production manager. So, initially I wasn't going to say, I'm going to write everything for me to be on the show. I didn't want it to seem like, Yeah, okay, I'm doing everything for me. I was like, I took a step back, and we were actually interviewing. I remember Janie and I sat at a Champs on Route 5, which is 7th Street, which is on the way from 35E to the airport. There was a Champs there. It's not there anymore. And we sat with Jeff Grayson, who did Fox Sports Midwest Brewers Live. He was like the post-game host for the Milwaukee Brewers. And we were kind of talking to him about being the host, whereas either Wade or myself or somebody was going to step in as, basically the number 2 guy that had the wrestling knowledge and pitching stuff, whereas as Jeff was supposed to be, the guy. And we went to out this place in Crystal, I think it was either Crystal or Plymouth. It was a soundstage, and it was like, all right, this is where we're going to do it. And again, the process is right. Yeah, we had the TV. We were going to plan on doing, a twice weekly radio program, which is where you had the experience from On the Mat with the radio program out there in the Cedar Valley, and then the internet presence, which was wrestling411.tv. So we get there, and man, I'm actually jumpy talking about this right now because I'm sitting there like thinking about all this stuff 10 years ago, and we're not even into the first episode, which was November 11th, but that was going to be the launch date. And when you talk about KOG, which is the student radio station at Augsburg College, we had called various radio stations in the area. We'd called basically anything that we thought we could buy some airtime on because we were ready to buy the airtime. And a matter of fact, one of them was KTIS, which if you live here now, that's University of Northwestern, which then was Northwestern College in St. Paul. That's like the biggest Christian radio station like in the area. Like there's no way we were even getting on that one. And I was like, oh, so and eventually we get to Augsburg, and they had the option to stream, which we were looking for, and we could record it, which was cool. Which is I know something you had always had a problem with at the radio station about recording a show. And there we had a spot, and it was cheap. I think they charged us $150 a semester to do the show out of Augsburg's KOG. So what was cool is that was a wrestling camp. I mean, we were literally across a quad from their wrestling room. So we were at a wrestling school with a, with technology, and then we get to planning. And you've always said this to me. I want to know about the first time you walked in to that office on Hennepin Avenue.
Yeah, I've told you that. I remember sitting there, and I just remember sitting in the office for the first time, and I just remember thinking to myself, this isn't going to work. You just had this feel, and I just trusted my instincts, and as it went along, I just knew as we went along that something wasn't going to work right with this. And I think even if we take a step back, the initial thought of this was just a place, a portal that was exclusive to promoting the sport of wrestling at all levels, just solely promoting. That was Jay's vision, that there was nothing out there that could truly just promote the sport. And I like that concept because I really think it fits into what our talents are and what we're good at doing, Jason. But I just remember thinking that, like, this just isn't going to work because there was nothing there that was of substance, and it just didn't feel like it was going anywhere. I didn't know what we were really doing, what our role was. And as I look back at the whole picture of it, I would say that you were 80% of the entire product and I was 20, because I only provided on-air talent. You did all of the producing, you did all of the production side, you did all of the computer work plus the talent side. So I didn't really do any of that. So
you scheduled the guests, though. You were the one who you took care of that.
Yeah. All right. I mean, I'll say that. So maybe I'll go 75% for you. But
thing is, you also had these relationships that I didn't have. I mean, you went out and had an interview with Stanley Henson towards the very end, and I had never met the late Dr. Henson. You'd had Mark Schultz on before. Mark Schultz, had Foxcatcher and went crazy with his social media. I mean, you had stuff when you would venture out on your own, and that's another thing too. Kyle and I were through this. We did not hang out together very often. We tried to bring media. I remember we tried to do this media thing where, like, on a Thursdays, we would get Jeff Beachy from the Guillotine, Andrew Hips from Intermat, you, me, anybody else that was like wrestling media in the area. We'd do lunch or something and talk wrestling at B-Dubs. I think we did that 2 or 3 times, but that was cool. But you and I weren't like hanging out after the show. It was like, all right, we're done. I'll see you Tuesday. I'll see you Thursday. I mean, it wasn't like a dynamic, we're spending all our time together. But I mean, I'll say you went above and beyond, in my opinion, in getting the guests. I mean, you're tracking these people down, and I'm like, whoa, how'd you get them? Oh, how'd you get them? So one, having somebody good to talk to on the other side of the internet was a plus, and you had that experience with On the Mat, which was I thought was a great thing that you brought to the table.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I guess again, it's just different perspectives on what you bring to the table, and I think whenever it's your own skill set, you're never going to be as complimentary about it as someone else that you feel is stepping up and being a part of it. But you're right. I mean, we didn't really hang out a ton, and again, we're talking about why it was a miserable year for me. Is I rented an apartment from Jay on the campus of the University of Minnesota, right to the side there, and it was just like a solitary confinement prison that I could go in and out as I pleased. But I was by myself. I had no friends. I didn't know how to reach out to people. I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't know how to make connections at the time. So it was just a pretty lonely time. And thank goodness for people that came into the fold, like Kurt Foley and Joe Bush, who was your roommate, which I felt connections with. But I'll tell you, I got to know the movie theaters by myself really well during that time. I went to a lot of independent movies and saw a lot of different movies while I was there. So it was the most movies I've ever seen in one time period. But I do remember, and as we talk about contrasting, it just seemed like you were pretty possessive of what you knew, and I tried a little bit, and so there was a time I couldn't figure something out, and it was at the NCAA championships, and I said, hey, I got to figure this out because Jason ain't going to help me on this, and so I posted it, and I remember you came over on Media Row and said, yeah, you got it up there, but you needed to do something else here, and so I got it up on the 411 website and got it rolling. So I tried my best to learn the tech side, but that was certainly your baby and where you were good and where you shined.
Yeah, and again, it's one of those things where there is the degree of ownership and such. And I'll be quite honest with you, I was not. I don't want to say I was I was mean by any stretch of the imagination, but again, I really wasn't. I was in a bad spot. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I was completely spending way too much time in bars when I was in Pennsylvania. I joke about the bison turf now at 39 years old, but at 27, let's be honest, I was unhealthy. I was probably close to 300 pounds. I didn't know really how to keep the facial hair very well. I mean, I just this massive goatee. It was really not attractive. It explains why I was part of the reason I was single for a while. I was also drinking probably a good pitcher or two at least a night, and then going home. And again, part of the reason where my house was is I could stumble home, I could walk home, and I was updating Intermat at like 3:00 in the morning so I could get that Boise State Portland State dual meet score that was 39-3 up before people woke up in the morning, and then I was struggling to get into work by 10:00 every day. So wasn't a great spot for me. So when I got to Minnesota, it was like a fresh start, and the weather right there. Joe had just finished running a marathon, so that kind of motivated me to start running some. I quit smoking because it was way too cold to smoke outside, and you couldn't smoke inside. So that was one positive almost immediately. It took me years later to quit chewing, but it was just like I was not in a great spot, and then kind of a fresh start, and then meeting Nick Slack. You had talked about Kurt Foley. I hung out with Nick Slack and some of that Augsburg crew, and then Joe went to St. Thomas, and the Tommy Johnny football game was huge up here, and just coming across things. And yeah, hey, I became friends with the movie theater too. I mean, if there was anything coming out on Friday, I'm at Rosedale Center seeing it at midnight on Thursday. So yeah, I'm right with you there. But as far as that ownership goes, yeah, it's like I wasn't a good teacher by any means, as I didn't have the patience to show somebody how to do something then like I do now. So, yeah. And Kyle, that because how many times have I showed you how to do something since then? And it's a lot more or less confrontational than it used to be.
Yeah, and that's why it's quite interesting, because at the time I think it's easy to do is you just say, this is my skill and I want to own this. And if I give up or relinquish this, I'm not as valuable. And at the time that was the case during that year, but in the intervening years since then, you've been great. You've been so gracious and showing me how to do things and posting our On the Mat on your program and being a part of our entire organization and advancing us. So it just shows you can grow and learn, and you don't have to stay in the vacuum you're in, and you can get out of it and do good things. But as we're talking about this particular year, yeah, there was some animosity. I don't know if that's the right word, but just some tension between us at a certain level that, hey, you had a certain way of doing things and you were talking about the drinking. Hey, I was into ultra marathons and I was still doing that. I was at the very end of it. So I was still training for some races and training for some 50 milers. And I did a 50K up in northern Minnesota while I was there and did a few other races while I was there. So I was at that level. I was still competing with running and some different outlets that way. So we were definitely coming at it from two very different spots.
So we start the first show, and I think we're excited about it. And boy, you could actually go back and listen to every single episode of Wrestling 411 by going to mattalkonline.com/wrestling-411. And that is everything. It's on a Spreaker player. You can scroll down to the bottom. The very first episode, November 11th, 2008, at KOG. Our guest, Kyle, was
Tom Brands.
Tom Brands was our first guest. I remember looking at we used a program called Nicecast, which is by Rogue Amoeba Software. And in the bottom corner, it showed you how many people were listening at the time. I didn't know how to use this program very well. We were capped at 50, and that thing peaked at 50 right away. I'm like, what the heck? And then I went back and figured out you could drop the quality from stereo to like 64K and get we could have probably maxed out at maybe 150 there. Oh boy, I remember the message board. Hey, remember to tune in to Wrestling 411, and it was just, oh my goodness. I mean, and then that first show. So the idea, we had two cameras, and one was like a 16:9, and the other was like a 4:3 aspect ratio. And I'm like, I don't know how to change I had no idea. And then I didn't realize that the cameras were Firewire because I couldn't find the cover for the Firewire. More on that later. So I got the two tapes, which was the HD, the digital tape. And then I bring them in to, once we get done with the show and we record it, we save the MP3 and then we upload it. So, because we'd already had a bit of a run through on how to upload the MP3 to the FTP site and then put that in the audio player, which officially became the first podcast because Peter Meister, who was the webmaster at the time, already had the feed set up to go into iTunes, which I had no idea about until about a month later. But we get there and I've got the video. And I'm sitting there, I'm going to edit this. And I'm trying to do cut shots with you and me. Whenever you're talking, I cut to you. And then it was just like, it took me 12 hours to edit that first 1 hour show. Oh, my goodness. And I was doing it in the office, not at my house. Not at my house. I was doing it in the office. And it was just, I was fried. And I was trying to find, YouTube wasn't owned by Google yet. We were trying to find a place. Blip.tv was ultimately where we found it. Because Dailymotion rejected us, I can't remember the other one. Bright Cove rejected us. YouTube rejected us because they only were limiting it at 10 minutes at the time. And so that first show, the audio quality was absolute shit. And because Brands couldn't hear us, I had to hit the sound. And thankfully, I knew how to run a soundboard from my days in college radio. And so the first podcast ever is to this day, the single worst episode of any podcast I have ever done. And it's out there to listen, folks. Oh. You can go judge for yourself. And you can understand, too, that you can hear the rapport between me and Kyle then was a little, it wasn't stale. It just wasn't developed yet because, again, we're coming in blind. We really don't know how to work off each other in this. Now, we got way better at that later. You can see that just even 2 weeks, 3 weeks into the show that I started understanding your dry sense of humor and playing off of that. But, man, that first show was hell.
Yeah, it was. It's just fun hearing you recount it because it really was. It was in that KOG studio, and we've been by that studio since then for some Alan and Gloria Rice Greco-Roman Hall of Champions banquets when we've held it there, and you were the master of ceremonies. We had a chance to see it, but it is funny going back there because it's so right. And I just had I was a little delusional on how big it was going to be, and I didn't have any idea, but I just thought, hey, we're a nationwide show and this can reach across the country, and just seeing it flirt up there with 50 and realizing at the end how bad the audio was. It was just a very rough product at the beginning there that got better. And you're right. You got to feed off each other. And I think to our credit is that because we do have opposite personalities, that it did work to be able to contrast each other, and it works into a good dynamic for the show. So I'm proud of that part of it. Even if we didn't have the best relationship outside of the show, I think on the show it was really exceptional.
One thing that you've always done with this, and we even did a couple of promo videos that did go up on YouTube. One was work ethic, and then the other was the nicknames. And you had introduced almost every show giving me a nickname, and it became I just didn't know what was going to happen. And now you've done this with Andy Hamilton as he's jumped in as your co-host on the mat, and even before him with Doug Van Gelder. Hail Caesar with all the on the mat references. But why the nickname? Because I mean, you've got you totally embrace your dry sense of humor, but the nicknames, you'd roll them off. You wouldn't even it'd be like with the He-Man of wrestling, or something. I can't remember what it was. It's like I don't know. The Ram. Yeah, that was that episode.
Oh, yeah, the Ram.
Yeah, you could be on He-Man. And I was like, you wouldn't necessarily be He-Man. It was just like, the delivery, like, where did that come from? Where did that kind of, the way you can throw a quip out there and not make it even look like it's serious or joking at the same time? I mean, it's just, the delivery on those is perfect.
I have no idea. I wish I had a great answer for that, but it was just something that, as we went along, I don't know if it was the very first one with Tom or if I started maybe 2 or 3 into that, but it just popped into my head that I was just going to call you the Thomas Jefferson of wrestling. And then I thought of a different one for the next time and a different one for the next time. And I just kept going with it. And then you had an idea, I'm going to do a nickname 411 video. And then I just wasn't going to stop from after that point because it became part of the show. So it was just something that popped in my head, and I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it. It was just something that popped into my head. And the same way with Andy is that it's not like I spend a week going into the show thinking about the nickname I'm going to give you or Doug or Andy. It just happens to be something that pops in my head, and I'm driving and there's a connection there. And so I know what you're associated with. And so I know that Thomas Jefferson's from Virginia. I know that you know a lot about wrestling, and I know that you like Virginia, so I called you the Thomas Jefferson of wrestling. And so I just went on with different stuff, and I think there was one I called you the ZZ Top, and you didn't understand it, and you were wearing a ton of jackets at the time, suit coats, and you didn't understand why I called you that. And I said, the girls go crazy for a short-dressed man. And you said, oh, okay, now I get it.
Yeah,
so
yeah. That was also
just fun because
that was part of my transformation too. I started wearing clothes like I don't know, I had a job.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like everybody can go through their entire year wearing a different wrestling shirt. Oh wait, we already did that. But
yeah, that's true. You did.
Yeah. So
that was a fun part. I'm glad that was a part of it, and it's one of my favorite parts of the show. Even now, is just the nickname part because I try to stay fresh. I remember there's one I combined it, and later you told me, I was like, yeah, you were trying a little bit too hard on that one. It's not very good. And it was like, yeah, you're right. And so some you hit, some you miss, but it's been a fun part of the show.
As we go back to that first episode and then getting things on, into iTunes and then seeing it's like, wait a minute, there's this. And then, okay. Ultimately, we realized that KOG, and we went through those first couple, let's see, November, December. So 2 months we're at KOG, and then editing the show was it was a pain in the ass. And then, so it got to the point where it's, okay, this file is rendering for an hour and 20 minutes. I'm going to go to, which then was known as Jake's. Now it's called Big Louie's. I'll go up there, and if it was Tuesday night, it'd be Bar Bingo. So I would sit there. We had recorded the show at KOG. I'd go back to the office. I'd start encoding, and when I got to process, I'd go up, play Bar Bingo, have a couple beers, turn around and go back, finish the show. And that got to be the pattern until we ultimately decided, dude, this 2-camera shoot thing is just too nuts. And I discovered I had Skype way early, and I'm sitting there going, do you think we can do this remotely? As I started looking into Nicecast, the program that KOG was using, I was like, why do we need KOG? We've got this program. We can stream it. The only thing we're not going to be is over the radio, which apparently nobody was listening to us over the airwaves anyway. So we decided right before Christmas, and I think Jake Herbert was our first guest that day, is, all right, we got a bunch of stuff from the office. Let's bring it down to the basement here in Arden Hills and buy some microphones and put the camera up and record a talking head type of show and throw the sponsors on there. I'm still learning how to use Final Cut and do it that way. And so then the studio no longer became KOG. It became Joe Bush's basement in Arden Hills, Minnesota.
Yeah, that's something. I mean, as you talk about it, it's just amazing how the memories just start flooding back from that basement that we had and how that was set up, and it worked out pretty good that we had it there. But just whether it was the dog coming in.
Casey the
mid-show.
dog, yes. The dog
Casey
interrupted the
dog
show one
came
time.
and we're laughing our heads off, and it was just so funny because that dog came in to Jake Pataxel and just him completely blindsiding us with how good he was, because when we brought him on the show, we both looked at each other like, oh my gosh, what have we gotten ourselves into?
Because neither of us knew him.
Killed it. He was awesome.
Yeah.
That was the coolest part. It was like, this was one of the best interviews we had, and we just didn't know what to expect, because when he came on, it kind of sounded like he's going to be dry. We don't know what he's going to be. And we rolled our eyes like, what is going on here? And then he was just awesome. And probably the highlight show for me, this was during that time where Kevin Jackson got hired. And we got both Kevin Jackson and athletic director Jamie Pollard on the show together because they were driving to a conference in Kansas City. And I remember getting done with that show, and it just felt like we had just won the Olympics, because it was just euphoric, because you just don't get ADs and the coach on the same show like that. I remember the feeling after that, how cool that was that we were able to do that. So those are just the two of the nuggets that we have, but it did feel good. I loved the product. I loved what we were doing. I felt like it was as good of a show as you were going to find, and not just in wrestling. I just felt like it was a great product, Jason. I felt like what we were doing was really good. And I think with that, it's always important to have contrasting personalities, because you don't want the same lane and the same perspective from both sides. And I felt like we both had a good angle, and we did a good job with the show.
Yeah, and one thing about the part of the show that came with it, and you had alluded to this earlier about the technical side. I mean, I didn't know anything about. I mean, I knew a little bit about video editing, because even before Flow, I had done some video editing. Matter of fact, I've got a video from interviewing David Taylor as a freshman in high school at the Beast of the East. I still actually have it on my Dropbox. He barely weighs 100 pounds, and that was 2005, 2006. So that was the infancy of right around the time I think Martin might have started Flow. But as we got to the point where we were in 2008, 2009, I'm sitting there Googling everything I can to find out podcasting information. It's funny because now I'll get calls from people that were in the same boat we were 10 years ago. And I was like, yeah, you need an ATR 2100, you get yourself a Zoom H5. Like you get yourself hosting with Blueberry, Libsyn, or Spreaker. It's funny how like I had no idea. And now, I've put out probably almost 2,000 episodes. I've hosted over 1,000 myself. And just the look at what we did there. And then you look at the television aspect. And at some point we have to backtrack a little bit to realize that when we both realized that this TV show wasn't going to happen, and we realized that money wasn't going to happen. And, I'll be completely honest too. It was, for me, it was a $20,000 a year pay raise. So that was also a big reason why I was leaving the NWCA. And it's like, ooh, I had a number in mind. I thought making $50,000 a year was a good thing. Cause I mean, I grew up in a situation where, we kind of valued our money a bit. And so that to me was always like, that means you're making a lot, you're doing good if you're making that. And that was, the number came at that. And I'm like, ooh, yes. And we were, I'm sitting there like, that's, the pay raise plus everything I wanted. And then we go into it, and then we're probably in November, early November, Wade leaves. I remember he was there at one meeting, and Wade's gone. And Janie had done everything she can. She made sure we got direct deposit as much as I could. It was so bad too, as far as the bad stuff. I had to drive down to the mall, to downtown, to the Sky Mall, like not like the magazine, but like the Skyways in Minneapolis, because it was the only Bank of America ATM in the state of Minnesota that accepted deposits. So any check that I got, I had to drive down there. And that was a bit nuts. But we get there and we realize the TV show's not going to happen. And we're like, all right, well, let's, I kind of I had kind of revived Intermat and brought that back from the dead. And it's like, all right, well, 411, I guess our website also has to become a news outlet. And we started going to Go for Duels and college events and doing live blogs and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did. We kind of just made up the product.
We did. Everything was just made up.
Really? Yeah, we just thought, all right, Minnesota State Mankato's close, so let's go try to cover this and be part of this. And the national duels are in Cedar Falls, so let's go down and cover at the Unidome. So we just said we're going to cover everything possible, and we're going to make this our own. And I didn't understand Janie at the time. I was funny about things because she always wanted to read my articles before I posted them, or read even what I was going to submit for Win on my own time. She was like, well, send it to me so I can read it. And I got really funny about that because I thought she was looking over the top of me. But as I went along, I just realized she cared. She just cared about us and was really invested in it and wanted to see us succeed. And not many people in your life are going to be that invested in seeing your well-being ahead of hers. And she certainly was that. I just didn't understand it until later in the product. And I've called her since. I called her, actually it happened to be on her birthday. I didn't even realize it until you told me, and just said, hey, I just really appreciated you and how much you did for us. And I think you had the same feelings when I called you, and we probably had just some hard feelings as we left, but I certainly did appreciate Janie, and still do appreciate both Jay and Janie for giving me that opportunity, because we didn't have to apply for the job, Jason. They believed in us and pursued us, and we got a unique opportunity that has still provided a platform for us to this day.
Yeah, and we look at what we were doing. So, and you bring up the Mankato thing, which was also very interesting because, again, it goes back to what we were talking about with wanting to do things with rights fees and such. And I had met Nick Cornder, who was at the time the sports information media liaison, athletic communications professional for the Northern Sun Conference, which at the time was based in St. Paul. I think they're out in Burnsville now. And they had the streaming. They did streaming on their website. And we're like, they're wrestling. It was, I think the first one we did, was it Upper Iowa or was it Nebraska, Omaha? I'm not sure. We did two down there. One was you and I, and we ran audio. We worked with the place down in Mankato, and we did the stream. They'd used our audio. We streamed it and then posted an archive of it. And they had our audio for that dual meet. And then you couldn't make it for one. We had Chris Willert sit in with me on another. I think he was with the Mankato duel. I think it was you and I for Upper Iowa. On that trip down there, we got to interview Terry Davis, the author of Vision Quest. This was one of, I think, the coolest moments of that year. This is the first time, the author of Vision Quest is in podcast form. I've since done one with him in terms of the 35th anniversary of the movie, but, we kind of fell into this. Wait, he taught at Mankato? I wonder if he's still down there. And we got to interview Terry Davis, the guy who wrote the book behind, wrestling's, I guess, most notable movie, Vision Quest, and there he was. We were sitting there in Jim Makovsky's office interviewing him.
That was awesome. And I went back yesterday as we were thinking about doing this podcast. I still have the notes that I wrote from that conversation, and they really were important to me. And again, as we talk about the value of that year, those were the things that really meant a great deal to me, because I did know this wasn't going to last. So I really did try to live in the moment every time we had these opportunities, and just try to wring out every piece of goodness we could in that. And that was one of those where it didn't matter what the interview was. I just wanted to be able to have this outlet, because it really felt like this is where we were supposed to be. This is what we were good at doing. And the Terry Davis interview was one of those opportunities that I was really grateful for, because he had so much insight. He's not and he'll admit he's just not a confident person. And so when we were giving him compliments, he said, I'm laughing because I could never imagine someone calling me a wrestling legend or someone who has made a difference in the sport, because that's not his personality. And so certainly that Terry Davis interview was one of the highlights of the year we had together.
One of the more memorable things that we also did was brought in Travis Picard and Michael Arias, otherwise known as TP and Esco, to do our theme song. And as soon as this thing launched, I remember Daryl Slater and Norm Wood. Both of them worked with me at the Daily Press in Newport News when I worked in the newspaper. Daryl now covers the New York Jets. So if you're a JETS Jets fan, you've read Daryl Slater stuff. If you're a Virginia Tech Hokie football fan, you read Norm Wood stuff all the time. These are Norm has been in my fantasy. I've been in his fantasy football and baseball leagues for years, and I suck so bad at these things. But Norm and Daryl were both still working at the Daily Press at the time, as was Kyle Tucker working at the Pilot, who was actually roommates with Daryl. He now covers Kentucky basketball for The Athletic. And I would just get voicemails all the time. This is the 411. I mean, we had a awesomely cheesy intro with just some awesomely badass lyrics. And TP and Esco they actually did a wrestling album too with songs about wrestling. But Yeah, that was one of the more memorable things. And I used to know all the words. And as we got into playing the show, the intro, I'd be like, 4-1. I had it ready to go. And just that would always kick us off right. We'd always get amped after hearing TP and Esco.
That was a great intro. And I appreciate that they did that because it was such a great way to start out the show. And you have to have good theme music. But as we talk about the name, we really haven't delved into that name. It really wasn't a good name. I even had to look up what 411 meant before we got the job. I didn't know it was a directory assistance or a place that you could go for information.
Well, because let me guess, you're on the party line back in Iowa. You didn't call 411. You just picked up the phone and be like, "Hey, Maud, connect me."
I don't know. I just didn't know what 411 meant, and then I had to look it up online, and so now I get it. But people butchered that. It was wrestling411.tv. And people would call it 411wrestling.com. No one could figure it out. So I think that really hurt us, the wrestling411.tv, because I don't know that anyone uses .tv to this day. And so I think we really struggled with a name that would catch on, because if people aren't getting it right, I remember Al Bevilacqua trying to promote it as 411 Wrestling. And it's like, man, if one of our greatest supporters can't even remember the name, we're in trouble, man.
Well, plus we had that, and there was a couple, Josh Lowe at Intermat, who then became at Intermat. It was Rev Wrestling at the time. Had, I think, Wrestling 411 USA, and then there was pro wrestling sites out there with 411 Wrestling Mania and Wrestling 411 Mania. It was a little confusing. Now, I will say this: I used the Matt.tv when I was at USA Wrestling, and .tvs are actually a little bit more prevalent now with like the YouTube channels and such. People doing YouTube and Twitch shows. So there's more of a prevalence of .tv now, but 10 years ago, yeah, that was not a thing. And another thing that was with the show is, once we realized we weren't going to be on TV and we're going to these events, the national duels come around, and I'm carrying this equipment, and we're still shooting footage like we're going to use it on the show. I mean, I'm bringing all these camera stuff everywhere. I mean, I flew to Vegas for the Cliff Keen. And was using. We never. I mean, I was collecting all this video, and what do we do with it? Nothing. And then, and then January of 2009 comes, and what happens in your hometown, Kyle? What happens?
You got in a car wreck.
I totaled my Chevy Blazer, which I had just paid off in October, and then had spent $400 getting the fuel pump fixed on Thursday, so we could drive down that Thursday. You went down with your, because you're from there, and I had to spend $400 or $500 to get it fixed, to get on the road, and then the next day, wipeout. I played chicken with a concrete barrier right there on 218, and rear wheel drive. This was not a 4-wheel drive vehicle, and that was all she wrote for my little maroon Blazer.
And then I think, if I remember the story right, I think my brother happened to stop. It happened to me and my brother that saw it or stopped.
Yeah.
Or something. I know my brother saw it, so I don't know if he stopped and said, "Are you okay, man?" And then the police came, but I know my brother happened to be driving by at that point, and he either saw it or he stopped. But of all people, it happened to be my brother that saw the whole thing happen.
Yeah, and then I get to the dome. I had a shaved head at the time, kind of buzzed, and I kind of had a gash on my head. It wasn't like a super deep one. It didn't involve stitches or anything, but I'm sitting there. I put my hat on. I take my hat off. It was like I'm going to the trainer to here I'm getting my head like some stuff on it, and then I'm talking to Jay, and Jay's like, "Well, he got here, didn't he?" It's like, yeah, because Kyle came to pick me up in the snow in his Ford Focus, and then Manny Rivera is standing there. He goes, "Wait, that was you that got in the wreck? We were right behind that." Mac Ryder, Manny Rivera saw the whole thing, so it was just like. Oh, now I still have the next vehicle. More about that vehicle as we get later on in the program to talk about that year. So I bought that vehicle at Shakopee Chevrolet off of carsoup.com. The one I still have today, the Trailblazer that I bought right after that, about 2 weeks later, I still have to this day. It didn't have as many miles on it as it did when I left Minnesota, but we get going, and then we get to the postseason. And this is one of the things that I think we did that really kind of set us apart. Because that was the year Brad Traviola was the chair of the wrestling committee. I believe that was his title. And we had a new qualifying procedure that was in place. And I had seen a little bit about this during my time at the NWCA. So we had a qualifying procedure. We had a lead from the NCAA on the show frequently to talk about how these at-large bids are going to work, or how the new qualification system is going to work, because that was like the big thing that year before, as you alluded to, the coaching changes with KJ and KL. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but that year we had a line. We were really the only line the public had to the NCAA about this whole thing, because we had Pat Tossi at the NWCA on, we had Moyer on the NWCA on, and we had Brad Traviola talking about it. So this is one thing where we really, I think, came into our own in terms of becoming a news outlet, was over things like this, that we had the access, and they were able to speak to us, and we could turn around and get it out and published quickly.
You're right. Yeah. So as you talked about, us just making this up on the fly and really morphing it into our own. So we never were bound by the restrictions of, here's what we're doing, this is the objective. We had an opportunity to just look at the big picture and say, we're not just focusing on Division I wrestling, we get to cover everything. So we made this epic road trip we had the junior college, then we went to D3s in Cedar Rapids. So junior college was in somewhere in Minnesota.
We had the junior colleges in Rochester. But thing is, that night, the last night of the junior colleges, we drove to Marshall, Minnesota to do audio for the Northern Sun, or Super Region 3 it was at the time. And again, I mentioned the Northern Sun and Nick Cornder and them. They used our audio again for their, we broadcast the whole day. It was a one-day tournament. We got there, and when we got there at like 2 a.m, we were just trying to find a hotel room. And apparently there was like a wedding party at this Holiday Inn that had one room that they didn't have taken by 3 a.m. And that was like, we went to like 5 or 6 hotels in Marshall, which is all of the hotels in Marshall, Minnesota, because the teams were in town. There was no rooms to be had. And we finally got one, and it was maybe 0 degrees.
Yeah.
And we did that, then drove back, did I think a show. And then we set out on the road trip to D3s in Cedar Rapids, D2s in Houston, D1s in St. Louis. And we were like, I remember pitching the idea to Janie. And I don't know, what was your response when we thought about, let's just drive to all of these?
Well, I don't remember my response to that. I think
I don't remember how it came up either.
Board.
I don't know who came up with the idea either. I mean,
I don't know. The thing I remember was that I had done the D3 broadcast for the NCAA championship finals. And so I contacted the NCAA and I said, we're going to be going to all these. Would you hire us? I think they paid us $100 each to do the D3s and D2s. So we were the play-by-play call for the D3, D2, and then I think we actually called maybe the first round of the D1s that year in St. Louis. I don't want to fabricate that if we didn't do it, but I think we were on board with, for sure, the D3s and D2s, so we were the play-by-play for the finals on that, because I had done it on my own the year before. So that got our foot in the door to be able to have a reason. So I think we went to Janie and said, hey, we have this opportunity. We can do the play-by-play for the finals, so why don't we just do this road trip and cover everything? And so it was where the D2 tournament was going to different locations. They were doing this all-sport Division II, and so it happened to be in Houston, which Texas doesn't have any wrestling. So we went from Cedar Rapids all the way down to Houston, then all the way back through St. Louis, and then up to Minnesota. So that was my recollection of it. We had a really good reason to go because we had those opportunities with the NCAA.
And one thing that we did with the Division threes is, and we were getting our recorders at the time, and this is, again, we're harnessing the power of understanding the podcast, and we were starting to pitch it like, hey, this is on iTunes, listen to us, or hit that, here's that link to listen to your, to download it. And then, back then there was no smartphone that was updating your podcast via iTunes or the podcast app. You had to literally plug in your phone with the 30-pin adapter, download the podcast, and then listen to them on the road. Well, we were doing it before, because we were only doing the finals for Division III. So we are both tracking down huge wins, upsets like crazy. That was the year Southern Maine had their first All-Americans in school history. And, Mike Morin, who's now their head coach, who actually just saw in Budapest a couple weeks ago. Like we're doing these little capturing the moment audio interviews and plugging them out there with our little itty bitty recorders. And it was, by this time, I think you had gotten the technology on how to pull it in and make sure it's an MP3 versus a wave. I mean, as my recollection is it was slow going on teaching you some of the technology, which is probably why rather than say, okay, let's do it slow, I was like, I'll just do it. I think that's probably where I was at that time. It's like, I'll do it. It'll be quicker. Then we can move on. But we did stuff at D3s that had never been done before. And
yeah,
then,
that's right.
And then we got to call the finals. And, then when we go down to Texas, then we're doing the entire thing, the entire 2 days and trying to do promo when we're sitting there. And at this point, Jay and Janie had said, you really need to leverage your own personal contacts to see if we can keep this thing afloat. And I remember, emailing people and the whole point of this whole thing initially was a little from a lot. We were just trying to get $1 or $5 from every tournament that to fund it. I mean, basically it was initially crowdfunding. And I know Jay told me he had all these pledges from people that were gonna contribute money from their camp or their club tournament, a little bit, like $1 per entry, or if it's a camp, $5 per entry. And then, when it comes time to fork over the money, nobody's forking over the money. So it leaves, Jay with empty pledges. It gets to us later as we're left holding the bag in terms of financially later. But we keep moving through the D2, D3, and we did do that Division I first day until I think ESPN didn't even pick them all up until the second day. So again, we were doing things nobody had done. And then the TV show idea with what you saw with Wrestling 411. I still have all the tapes, but it's very similar to there's the Takedown Radio kind of has the concept that we were trying to implement. They had it with Takedown TV. I mean, with what Willie and CP do with FRL, that was very similar to what we had started with. Even though we had interviews, it was very very similar concept. I'm not going to say anybody copied anybody by any means, but we were ahead of our time in that respect to see. What I'm doing now, what you're doing now, is all 10 years ago. We were doing it then, but we just didn't have the money to make sure it could go more than 1 year.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't realize it at the time. You put it in terms that I still have a hard time grasping. I was just along for the ride. I was just enjoying the interview processes. I loved what we're doing. I was sicker than a dog down in Houston, and we didn't even have rooms. We had to get hooked up. We were so lucky to be able to just get a spot on the floor. And who gave us the room?
It was the NWCA, because I never burn a bridge in terms of when I'm. I left the NWCA on good terms. It wasn't they didn't want to see me go, but ultimately a year later they sold the website anyway. So I'd have been looking for a job anyway. But Jeff Brees, who's now the head coach at Lake Erie College. Was previously at Buena Vista. Well, he had been coaching at Seton Hill, and he had a media background at NC State, and he was hired to take over Intermat after I was gone. So I go from at the NCAAs and in NWCA picking up everything, and then all of a sudden now I'm asking Pat Tossi if me and Kyle can sleep on Jeff's floor, the guy who replaced me, and now we're sleeping on his floor in Houston. And the Houston thing too, in talking with Jim McCoskey, I went over to their hotel. And this is probably one of the biggest blunders the NCAA has ever done with the festival, and that's where they put indoor swimming. Swimming is, of course, indoors. Indoor track, swimming, and wrestling all in the same area. Well, they put all these teams in the same hotel, and you've got like 900 athletes, seasons ending all at the same time. So this was like a 30-floor frat party. It was one of the wildest things I'd ever seen. And we're talking slow clap. We're talking toilet paper races off of like the 30 pizza box just floating. I mean, I think I had to stay in Makovsky's room till about 3:30 in the morning till all the cops left so I could walk back to our hotel. And then we could drive to Sarah Levin's house in St. Louis.
I don't remember any of that part of it. I do remember it.
Well, I'm the one who was social still. So you weren't up partying with me. I was.
I was probably so glad to be able to sleep and get back there. But man, it was what a crazy road trip. We were on the road for 3 solid weeks, and yeah, it was just it was nuts. And that's just March, and we still had other stuff we needed to do. We were going to go to Junior Nationals in Fargo, so it didn't end there. But I think the concept really started to take form after that road trip. It just showed, all right, we're going to cover everything. There's nothing off limits within the sport of wrestling. We care about it all equally. It's all part of the same family, and we're going to give it equal coverage. And I felt like we did a really good job at spreading the wealth.
There was also a moment that realized that we could start time shifting things, and it was in mid-February, and we're talking about Virginia Tech and Old Dominion. We were chatting about it because Tech was ranked 15th, and ODU was ranked 21st, and it was like, man, it was a Tuesday we're doing it, and then we get done with the show, we're talking about it. It's like, man, I should go to that duel. And it's on a Thursday, and here it is a Tuesday. And I was like, well, wait a minute. We could record the show for Thursday like now, and then had it set to auto post because our back end on the website was WordPress, and those of you know you can schedule posts. So I woke up Wednesday morning. I said, we're going to do it. And I got up and I drove to Virginia, just drove to Virginia. I called Mike Dixon, who's then the assistant coach. Is like, hey, you want me to announce the match tomorrow? Yeah. You coming? I was like, yep, I'm getting in the car now. I'll see you tomorrow morning. He's like, you're driving? I'm like, yep, be there in the morning. So I drove 22 straight hours. I think I did stop.
Yeah.
And then what was crazy about this is kind of one of the biggest moments and thing is, this is where having the job at 411 allowed me to do this, that it would be abnormal to think any regular employer would let me just, okay, I got to go announce this match in Virginia, and then I'm going to drive around the state. So I announced the match against Virginia Tech, and ODU wins. At the time, it's the biggest win in school history in terms of a ranked team. Then the next day, the AAA state wrestling tournament is in Chesapeake, Virginia, at Oscar Smith High School. So I show up. I haven't been there. I left, at this point 4 years ago. And hey, JB's back. I watched the first day, and then that night, I'm like, well, wait a minute. Pocosin had some issues with its coaching situation, my high school, and they were AA, and their high school state tournament was on the other side of the state out in Roanoke in Salem. And I'm like, you know what? After this session, I can get in the car. I called up a buddy. I was like, hey, you got a place for me to crash? Like, yeah, come on. I get in the car. I drive 4 hours to Salem after the first day. I wake up and I get there. And the second day of the AA tournament, I think Pocosin has 4 state champions, had 5 in the finals. It was a real season of turmoil. And my friend Dan McAdams was a guy I brought out for the wrestling team my senior year. I needed a workout partner. I was basically the only other big guy in the school that was going to wrestle. And Dan was a football player. He'd been there. He had moved back. He moved to Carolina and then moved back. And he's a year behind me. And I'm like, hey, let's, he had started dating my friend Christy at the time. And I was like, dude, I need Emil Cochet was his football teammate. And, we're all friends. I was like, hey, you come out for the team. I figured my idea is like, okay, I got another guy to work out with. Dan ends up beating the living crap out of me while I was in high school. So when Dan was playing football, his little brother Chase was about 6, and he started playing football. Dan was 58. Chase was 58. So then Dan starts wrestling that year. Chase starts wrestling that year. So we fast forward. I am in Salem. Chase McAdams is now a senior in high school. He is undefeated, 41-0 going into the state finals. He had been 6th, third, I think. And he had lost to this. He had actually lost to Derek Borley, I think, twice. He ended up wrestling at Wisconsin for a minute. And he was in the state finals, and it was a season of turmoil. And I'm there, and I watched Chase's first year as a kid wrestler. He went 0-16 and got pinned 16 times. I get to see him win a state title, and it was one of those things that Chase ended up wrestling at King University, Division II for a little bit. Now he's a trucks racer back in Langley, Virginia. But to sit there and just say the opportunity to get up and go, and then ultimately saw this moment in wrestling that made me understand that wrestling, it was so powerful to watch Chase go from never winning a match to winning a state championship, and being there to see it really was one of the more moving parts of my wrestling life, to see a moment like that. And I speak of this moment quite frequently. I've written a column about it, but it was that year. It was because we had the opportunity to not be tied to a desk, and we could do things kind of on our own accord, that gave me the opportunity to announce my alma mater's biggest win in school history and see one of my best friend's little brothers win a state wrestling championship in the span of 36 hours. Was, you really, it failed, but, and there's definitely some real victories in that year. And that's just one of those stories.
That's a great story. And I love that you had that chance to do it, because I think what it did, Jason, was it extended our reach. And I think we were willing to do that, was to go anywhere, anytime, at any place. And we were going to go on the road, and we were going to find where wrestling was. And so I think it's just great with a story like that we had the latitude to go to places. So you could go to Virginia and have great experiences like that. Even though we were a force of 2 at the time for a year, we were able to extend our reach quite a ways throughout the country.
I mean, we went to San Antonio. We saw the Alamo. We had some pretty good salsa down at the Riverwalk. We interviewed Leroy Smith at the Hall of Fame. And this is a cool little story about the Hall of Fame. So you obviously knew Leroy better than I did. So we go to Stillwater on our way through, down to Texas from St. Louis, because we had stopped at Sarah Levin's house in St. Louis on our way to Oklahoma, on our way to Texas. We stop into the Hall of Fame, and we interview Leroy right there. And this is, again, the technology. We couldn't figure out how to stream anything really super great. So we just had the computer up there, and we used the laptop speaker to record it, the microphone. And, Leroy goes, "Hey, where are you guys going to stay?" And Kyle, where did we stay?
We stayed at Big Leroy Smith's house. So Leroy Smith Sr., we stayed at his house. And I remember the next day he took us to breakfast, and we tried to pay, and he said, "No." He said, you're not going to do that. He goes, "I'm paying. If you do, well, you're going to hurt my feelings." And so just a great experience where we were in the true Smithsonian, and we got to see all of the plaques and everything that had been accumulated through wrestling's most famous family. And that will be a great memory that we always get to share.
I remember he said, because at the time, again, at this point, I think John Smith was still questioning what my first name was. I mean, it's one of those things. It took about 10, 11 times. It was, "Oh, hey, Jay," to get the name. And now I'm sitting there, I'm sleeping at his childhood home, So, so we're sitting there and we're talking, and I'm looking around at the walls, and I remember just, asking Mr. I was like, "So what, how big's the family anyway?" And he goes, "Oh, we got 10 kids. We're not sex fiends. We're just good Catholics." And I sit there and I'm like, I just kind of chuckle about that. And then I said, "Well, who's the biggest name that's ever sat in this living room?" And he goes, "Well, where you're sitting, Alexander Medved sat right there where you're sitting right now." I'm like, "Well, that's pretty cool." Says,
Yeah.
all them boys, all them boys like to sleep on the couch everywhere. And then we start walking around the house, and there's John Smith's like world championship giant trophy right next to Chris Perry's like third grade baseball trophy. And like, and he's going through the family photos and stuff there. And he's like, "Hey, that's Christopher there with a hat on backwards." And then as I can't verify this, but I don't know if he ever brought up JT Realmuto's name during that day, but the catcher for the Miami Marlins.
Oh yeah.
He was
That's
in those
right.
pictures. We weren't talking about him because he was talking about the other wrestlers. That's my other grandson Matthew there. That's another grandson. Mark there. It's just so many kids, and I love the fact that Grandpa Smith had everything. If it was soccer, if it was baseball, if it was John Smith's world championship gold medal, or what. I mean, everything was on the wall. I mean, it truly was a Smithsonian. So. It's just I still talk about that moment. By the way, the restaurant was called Jimmy's Egg, by the way.
Wow.
And we actually drove by
Kudos.
John Smith Fieldhouse at Del City High School.
Yeah. Where they had the statue out front.
Yeah, Mark Branch said that the
Fieldhouse
Mark Branch told me the other day that the gym at his high school is named the Mark Branch Mark Branch Gym. I said, "Do you have a statue like John does in Del City?" He goes, "No."
Yeah, man, that's cool. And again, we go back, and for me, even though it was a really tough year, you just had great experiences like that you can't replicate, and you just feel so honored to be part of those great legacies. And we got a chance to see a ton of stuff within a year, and we packed it in there, man. We got to see so many different things and have so many unique experiences that it almost doesn't seem right that we got to be around such greatness for that long. So again, it's so humbling that we got a chance to have our foot in the door, and that springboarded us into where we are today.
I think the beginning of the end came when we realized that, okay, the season's over. What do? We change up our format, and this is where it really got because I would stay up so late, and I at that time I had met my my now wife at the time. We had so after the season, so March 25th, March 22nd was the last day of that tournament. So we drive back. You end up getting a ride back with somebody else. I end up driving, and during this process, matter of fact, I got an email before we left on this road trip from eHarmony. And again, full disclosure, I met my wife through eHarmony, and I got an email, and I was closing out the string. I'm like, I'm done with eHarmony. I had been on a couple, mediocre dates. I was like, I'm over it. I'm going to save the money. And Abby in St. Paul requested communication. And it's like, "Hey, I'm about to go on this road trip. I'll be on the road for the next 3.5 weeks. Here's my email," because we had gotten past the point where you can go open communication. And I remember staying at your parents' house in the guest room, trying to send an email to Abby from my Gmail account on the phones that they had given us. And it wasn't even like really a true smartphone. I'm just like, I just remember that. It's like, okay, how do you say your name? Anyway, so we end up getting done with that. And then, so my first date with my wife, well, now my wife, is 3 days after nationals. So she missed all of this drama that we had gone through with anything. So, I start dating my wife after wrestling season. So again, Wrestling 411, we had the ability to time shift stuff. So high school nationals is in Virginia Beach. So we're like, hey, I got an idea. Let's, instead of doing 2 1-hour shows a week, Tuesday and Thursday, let's do 4 a week. We can record them all in one day, and we can bang them out Monday morning, and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we're good. Friday, we don't have a show. We do 4 30-minute shows a week, and we can get more people out, and we can try to drum up more interest and whatnot. And, part of that was kind of selfishly so I could get up and go on, take a trip to Virginia, which I got up and went to high school nationals. So, I mean, we end up churning up more content in a more condensed format. And it was just, that was the point where Kyle, a couple years ago, were talking, was like, dude, we would do maybe 2 hours of real work each week.
I mean, Jason, am I wrong though? We did all of what we needed to do in a week. We got it done on Monday. So we'll give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. Let's just say we put in 4 hours, and then there really wasn't much the rest of the week. We did our stuff, and then that was it. There was absolutely no reason to go into the office. It was just a place that had internet, and neither of us really did.
Oh, I actually brought the whole production stuff home in like December. Like, I don't think I went back into the office to get anything. Matter of fact, I think I have one of the Minnesota like second place trophies sitting around here somewhere that was like in a box that I had actually picked up. I was like, oh, how'd this get in here? And and then I've got that. And then here's another thing I learned in hindsight, going through, if I would have known today, or then what I know today, like right now, as we edit this show, I got microphones, we've got, I've got Audition running and recording. I got a backup issue thing recording here. I mean, we could have run the video into the Mac and we could have done everything one shot and had no editing. Instead, I was 8 hours a show or 4 hours a show. And we could, I mean, again, the technology did not exist for us. We would have been on, like, if this were happening today, we'd have been on Twitch. We'd have been on YouTube Live. We'd been on Facebook Live. I would have known the transit. We just didn't. Yeah. We were ahead there. The technology wasn't affordable for us yet. And it's just crazy to sit back and look at what's available, what wrestling has benefited from in technology. The number of podcasts. I mean, when we put this show out, it was one of 2 podcasts. And we didn't even know about the other one because I didn't discover them till like 2-3 years ago. These guys out in Western Iowa called Mat Slammers have been doing a show since 2006. I remember discovering the first podcast I ever listened to was Eddie Goldman's No Holds Barred, which talks about wrestling periodically. I mean, he's been around a long time, and that was the first podcast I ever listened to. But we went from 2 wrestling specific podcasts to now I think there's, at last count, 52 active shows. And that doesn't even count the shows that have done 5-6 episodes and then pieced out, or if somebody wants to start a show and then never does anything again. So, it was, the first true national wrestling podcast was Wrestling 411. So, yikes, 10 years.
I had no idea. Yeah, again, I never had a grasp on any of that. We did our thing, and I was in my own bubble. I wasn't on social media. You had that piece, so I never got feedback on anything, and the only feedback you'd get was if someone left a comment on the 411 website. And man, Jim McCoskey said he would listen around the kitchen table, I think, and gave us some great feedback. And I've always appreciated Jim's enthusiasm for the sport and the project we had, and he seemed like one of our best advocates. So you appreciated those things, and it felt like it did mean something to some people. I don't know if it really moved the needle or not. You would know better than I would based on just numerical values and what people talked about, but it's hard to say. I just know that we did our best with what we had, and regardless of anything, I felt like the content was really solid and that it was something people could get behind and appreciate. And so because of that, I'm proud of that year.
Yeah, and one thing I remember, the World Team Trials in Council Bluffs that year. Drove down. I was going to do some broadcasting for USA Wrestling. Again, the type of wrestling for one. For us, it was good because I felt that anything we were on, we could say. Well, when we asked the NCAA and Webstream Productions, I think was the company out of Indianapolis that they were using at the time, was like, hey, can we say our outlet? Can we say Wrestling 411 on here? And they said yes. And we're like, that's a slam dunk for you know, in terms of like, you know, I'm doing the stream with Van Stokes, like, hey, Jason Bryant from Wrestling 411 here at, you know, Council Bluffs. Well, I'm outside and I was actually had started my first marathon training, which was, you know, an epic fail, but I'm out running in about 90-degree heat outside. I ran about 2 miles around the facility, and I see Matt Holt, who at the time was a Greco-Roman wrestler. He's now in Vegas, but he was a guy who was at the training center for a long time. It was always kind of a rough around the edges guy. I didn't know very well, kind of opinionated guy in the wrestling forums, pretty funny sense of humor, but, you know, him and I weren't like, we knew each other, but we weren't like super friends by any means. I mean, we've become friends over the years since then, but he said, yeah, man, I listen to every show. I listen to it while I'm working out. And I'm like, what? Like, so there was an athlete that was sitting there listening to our stuff while they were in the gym. And it was like, that was like the light bulb. And at this point, it was kind of May, and we were kind of really towards the beginning of the end, because things were really starting to go. We were not sure where we were going. We were still trying to struggle on how we were going to continue this. I had apparently taxes that were due. I was trying to pay for dates for my girlfriend at the time. And, you know, it was just, you know, there's different ways to market it. And then I think we just ran out of time. And I think once Fargo rolled around, I think that was kind of the last straw for you and I at that point was, are you working for USA Wrestling? Like, because I went out to Fargo and USA Wrestling picked me up as a freelancer, and I did zero work for Wrestling 411 that trip. And that was really kind of one was like, are you working for USA Wrestling, or are you working for us? It was kind of like a, you know, I remember that divisive moment we had, and then we come around back from August and we do one good hard month of interviews. I think you had done some travel and gotten some stuff. And then August was pretty much the end of it, because I didn't get paid for that month. And we had a meeting shortly thereafter, and that was where we're in a meeting. I think it was at the U with you, me, Janie, and Jay. And it was, where do we want to move forward? And you said, I want to be done. And you got up and walked out. And that was the last time Kyle Klingman was around with 411. You didn't hear the rest of the conversation. I was wondering what the hell I'm going to get, you know, who owes me $4,000, you know, essentially was what it was.
Yeah, I forgot I walked out on that meeting, but yeah.
No, that was the end of it. That was the question.
Yeah.
Jay gave us the question first, and we decided, and you were like, I'm going to walk away. Thank you for your time, and walked away. And I not to blow smoke, but after you says, hey, can we just get him paid? Okay. I feel real bad about our relationship after all this. Can we at least get Kyle what he owes? And Jay's like, well, what do you mean? Oh, you know, I'm out of money. You know, I'm out of money for this project. And, you know, I went back earlier this week and talked to Jay and Austin Schanfelter about it. And it's like, yeah, they're combined. They probably lost about $180,000 between the two of them on this project. And, you know, in our case, it wasn't for lack of trying. It's just, you know, the TV thing never got off the ground, and, you know, there was no real long term there. And by the way, I found out the hard way that I was an independent contractor, not an employee. So I went through that whole year without health insurance. Yikes.
Yeah. Yeah. It just, yeah, and yeah, I was unemployed for a full month. And so I really, for that month, it's scary, because I had no clue what I was going to do, what the next steps were. I went out to New Hampshire for a wedding. And so I just made a commitment that I wasn't going to just sit around. I was going to be active and go places. So I went to New Hampshire and Colorado and did some things. And it was just a lot of questioning of what's going to happen next. I had no clue. And then it worked out that I could come back as the director of what was still the Dan Gable International Wrestling Institute Museum. We merged a year later with the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. And I'll tell you, as I look back, I was so underprepared for that job. I had no clue what I was getting into, and it was just trial by fire. And as you talked about, if you could go back and say, if I know now what I knew then, man, I wouldn't have hired myself. I was not ready. I just did not know what I was getting into with budgets and how to do things. But that's how everything works, is you got to go through a learning curve. And I did, and I'm still learning. And a big part of that learning was the 411 years. And man, I kind of the end for me was, I remember we just were doing our things, and I went out to Oregon with Kurt Foley to one of the Jay Robinson camps and did interviews out there. And hey, I knew it was going to end. So I just said, all right, I've got to just squeeze this out and try to do some cool things, and went to the camp and did some interviews that I wanted to do for 411 while I was out there, and interviewed Jay and Fred Fozzard and some people. But that was the end for me, as far as just production, was going out there at the end of a Jay Robinson camp out in Oregon, and then it was pretty much over by August, September.
Yeah, I think the last show that we ever did was ever posted actually was the Stanley Henson interview, September 1 from 2009.
Oh.
I think that was one on that trip that we were at in Colorado.
Oh, okay.
So, and then
Okay.
from there on out, I mean, it was shortly thereafter. You went your direction. I was still in Minnesota because I had a house at the time in Pennsylvania, and this is where I bring this back. Is I was renting this thing out, and you know, at a time in August, I was off the grid because Abby was at the time leaving one company and going to another, and she had figured out the voluntary layoff plus the signing bonus and the start date, so she had the whole summer off. So it was like, okay, we got to spend a lot of time together. And then she left to go to South Africa for 6 weeks. And she was volunteering for a Christian outreach organization teaching kids in South Africa English. And then she had it planned, and she had this planned long before she met me, that she was going to spend a week in Cape Town during that last week she was there. Talked me into going. I was like, well, you know, our company's I don't really have a whole lot. And so she actually picked up, you know, she said, no, we're booking it. You're coming. And so I spent my 29th birthday moving to Minnesota and having a shake at Steak and Shake with my mom and my friend Terry at 29. And on my 30th birthday, I'm with Abby in South Africa on a safari. So, you know, and then a month later, I'm in Denmark at the World Championships freelancing for USA Wrestling as they're looking to create a third communications position, which let's be honest, the position was written for exactly what my skill set was. So whether or not anybody else applied, they pretty much wrote it for me. And that was kind of one of those things where, all right, that's cool. I landed on my feet there. Ended up taking a bath on the house. I think I ended up taking, you know, financials for what they may be. I think I took a $30,000 loss on on the house plus the lost wages from that month. But we look at where we came out of this. I mean, what you guys got with the Gable Museum and the relationship with the Hall of Fame is so awesome. I mean, we went down to the basement of the Gable Museum probably 2 years ago, and we unearthed some stuff that Ed Ewalt had sent, you know, his old books. I've got one of them right here, one of his old teaching binders with the National Junior College Championships from 1960 with the first names, the hometown, the schools. I mean, all the stuff that's never been digitized. And, you know, it was cool that our working relationship then might have fallen apart, but in the years since, our friendship has kind of blossomed. And, you know, again, I was I wouldn't say I was kind of a jerk. I was standoffish. You're right. I was I was pretty much like, I'm Jason Bryant. I brought Intermat back from the dead. I'm the biggest thing in wrestling. And nope, you know what? When we failed, nobody gave a shit, Kyle, because it's not about who. It's the content might have been great, but you know what? When you move off of it, you know, when I left Intermat, everybody still kept using Intermat's rankings who was using Intermat rankings before. It didn't matter. It was like, okay, well, that's Intermat. You know, like Tom Owens before me. I mean, I was, and then me, and then Jeff Reese, Andrew Hibbs has got it now. People are going to use who they're going to use. So it was probably the biggest thing about it to me personally was it was kind of the gut check to my ego that I needed. And yeah, I was cocky about it. Like, you know, I'm the Intermat guy. Like, nobody cares. Quit being a douche. So it really was a humbling thing. It really was a humbling thing for me. I think that whole situation and meeting a woman who has grounded me in terms of not being able to I don't have to think about wrestling 100% of the time, even though I think about wrestling about 97% of the time now. So, you know, everything about the move to Minnesota, you know, it taught me how to use things that I use with USA Wrestling, and then to Amateur Wrestling News, and then to Matt Talk. Ultimately, what I'm doing now is what we did 10 years ago. And now it's actually financially beneficial for, well, at least one of us. So, you know, it's just funny. In 10 years, you know, everything's come full circle. And I think I'm a better person for having gone through the process. And, you know, our relationship has been good over the years. And, you know, it's one of those things that, man, I honestly thought I lost Kyle Klingman as a friend for that era. And we've reeled it back in. And now the dry wit still surprises me.
You did. I mean, it was, and don't ever think that we were like right away. It took probably 2 or 3 or 4 years after that to let it really come back around, and you just had to take a break away and go our separate ways before it came back around. But man, my last memory of that, when you talked about Cape Town, was I was in the office and you came in and you and Abby had gotten me something from Cape Town, and you said, "Hey, we got this for you." And as soon as you left, I threw it in the garbage. And it was I was really hurt, man, just by how everything went down. And so I just left not in a great spot mentally. And I'm just glad it came back around. And like you say, you don't burn bridges, but man, it took a little while, just like with anything. You have to have some separation, and it took that. But again, now I'm super grateful that you've included us on your podcast. You've been very good to me and the Gable Museum, using your talents, because Craig Sesker said it once to me. He's like, yeah, he said, Jason has a unique set of skills that no one else has. And I agree with him.
Well, I did not know the story about the gift. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, what did we get him? So
it was like a mask or maybe a monkey or something out of wood. I think it wasn't like it was it wasn't something like it was worth $1,000, but you got me something. I just chucked it.
I think is at the time, I mean, it was the point where part of it could have been where, like, I think I had gone from egotistical jackhole to love struck. So my mindset was still not on anybody else. So, I mean, I don't know if I can make I don't know if I'm trying to justify, I'm not justifying, but I'm trying to remember where I could have been mentally to say why I was oblivious to this. Because again, you want to talk about socially awkward? I was a walking case study in, like, not being oblivious to everything around me, other than, what I mean, it was just, it was definite ego that was just, real problematic. So, I mean, it was, like I said, it was a gut check. It was an eye-opening moment. And, I will always say my intentions were never to piss anybody off, but, sometimes I can come off the wrong way. And even to this day, I struggle with, certain things on how I react to people. I mean, just look at my my interactions with Survey Monkey right now on Twitter. But but I mean, it's just just the things that we've been able to do. Whether you've got On the Mat and working with Andy there, and in track wrestling right there in the museum, and you guys are about to set to go through. Just we look back 10 years. I mean, I think we brought On the Mat back into when did I restarted the podcast for USA Wrestling? Probably 2000, probably about a year and a half after that. And then you guys sent me some DVDs or some CDRs with the old On the Mats to get in there. And we've got probably almost 400 and some episodes there on the network that you can go back and listen to. So, I mean, Kyle and I, we joke around, we have fun now, but it was tumultuous. I always felt bad about how it ended. I didn't know it was to that extent, but I remember when you walked out, that was like the one thing that I was like, man, I was probably a jerk to that guy. Like, I didn't, like I said, I never meant it to be, but 10 years later, we've got, thousands of podcasts out there, or hundreds and hundreds of podcasts out there. And I've been able to educate people and as well as become pretty good friends again there, Mr. Klingman.
Yeah, that's the best part, is that you can get through it. Nothing's automatic, as you know, but it's just over the course of time, things play out in a certain way, good or bad. And fortunately for us, it's gone in a positive direction rather than really negative or even neutral. It's turned into something positive, which is always good. And it's fun to have things come into the fold. I mean, seriously, man, you have more experiences in this than I do, but going to the World Championships, we're both there together in Budapest. And I'll tell you what, that was, I said it the right way. And it was it's surreal that I got that opportunity through track wrestling. Just surreal, because I am so fortunate to have these interactions and these opportunities that I just never want to take that for granted, that I got a chance to be over there and be at the World Championships. And you've had, I don't know how many, you've had 50 to 100 of those overseas trips, maybe more than that, but there was my first one since 2006 that I've been overseas, so 12 years. And I'll tell you, I'm so grateful for all the opportunities, the incredible people that we've gotten to meet and be around and interact with and learn from them in a very intimate way. And so I wouldn't want it any other way. Even the hardships are really what has built us into who we are today. And there might be more ahead of us, but I think we know how to manage the heartaches and the adversity better than we have before.
I think when Kyle and I were texting about this beforehand, we were talking about the honesty level or the openness level. It was like, do you want honest or controlled honest?
Well, yeah, I feel like this has been an honest picture of what happened, and I don't think you want to hold anything back when it comes to where you are and how you got there, because that's what it takes. It's never just a clean road. It's messy, and as it goes full circle, I'm so grateful to Jay for believing in us. I think that's the overriding thing that I want to take out of this, is that he thought enough of us to get us on the ground level for this project. And man, I didn't have to apply for a job, and here we are now, and we have our own different directions. So thank you, Jay.
Yeah, and he also made a point that through the whole process, when we have to go through and try to raise funds and all this stuff, we were the ones, it's pretty much, they both admit the fact that we were the ones that were left holding the bag. So money was spent, money that we didn't have at our disposal that should have been, that was not fundraised in the way it should have been before we were there. They both admit, Jay and Austin go, yeah, you guys were left holding the bag. Your skill sets were what they are. We were kind of forced to do things that we were not prepared for, we hadn't planned for. And, that's one thing I still struggle with fundraising. I know you're working with a nonprofit. You've got some additional help with fundraising, but this program, for example, is crowdfunded. So there's about 50 people out there that contribute to this program monthly. So I'm appreciative for them. But, we look at that back in the day, the Patreon didn't even exist. I mean, there are so many ways to crowdfund shows now. I mean, there are people out there making $50,000 a month for a podcast. And, we're like trying to, hey, there's a PayPal link. Oh, I don't trust PayPal. I mean, just so many different things that could have changed. And, again, we got, not to make, pat ourselves on the back by any means, but yeah, there's some things that, in hindsight, I wish I'd have been more aware of my own self at the time. I mean, I wish I could have been a better coworker, a better person as a whole. And then I also just, I wish we'd have had a chance to really do it. But I think, again, like Jay said yesterday, we were ahead of our time in that respect. And maybe, and with us as a team, as a dynamic, we were probably ahead of our time to be ready working with each other as well. So, it's just funny how, 10 years, how things change and how things come back around. And, I just, the whole 10 years of podcasting is what the old idea behind the show was. But we got into a real deep dive introspective of a lost year. And one that we did see a couple movies. Two of the ones that I remember the most were The Wrestler and State of Play, which two fantastic films. State of Play, as you still talk about, is one of the most underrated movies out there. But yeah, so
I think it's the most underrated movie. If anyone hasn't seen it, I would recommend go watching it now. I've asked so many people, have you seen State of Play? And every single person other than you says no. And I don't know how that's possible.
Because I saw it with you. That's the only reason why.
I know how it's possible, not for you, but for other people that they haven't seen it. It has Ben Affleck. It has Rachel McAdams. It has Russell Crowe. It's so good. And I don't know why it just hasn't been seen by as many people. So that's our pitch. If we could end it on that, go see State of Play. It's awesome.
Also, I'm going to release some separates, maybe do an extended nickname 411 here on the feed at some point in the future. Just reference this episode. Again, Kyle and I began our podcast journey 10 years ago this week. November 11th, 2018 is where we're at now. November 11th, 2008 was the first show. You can go back and listen to that entire library of Wrestling 411 because while a lot of the things have changed since then, heck, we didn't even get to the coaching changes, man. There was so much that year was Kale, was KJ, was just the Dominoes, Russ Hellickson. I mean, it's just so many different things to go through. You can go through everything that happened that 10 years at mattalkonline.com/wrestling-411. There's a playlist there. You can go back and it's like, oh, what happened when? You can just find it. And because Kyle and I, as much as the dynamic was different back then, we still had good guests. We had great questions. We documented it like nobody else did. And 2008, 2009, again, our start in podcasting and like I said, it was ahead of its time. And,
you got Helen Maroulis on there.
We got Helen Maroulis. I think we had Adeline too. I'm not quite sure. I know we had Helen. Helen was like 16.
what? Somehow you knew that she was going to be good, and you were like, we got to get her on there. So I don't know if it was her first interview, but it was had to be one of the first, and she ended up being the first Olympic gold medalist for the United States in women's freestyle wrestling. So, man, what a great way to have some documentation. And so you showed me that, and I went back through some of those interviews. I'm like, wow, I forgot we did all these. Chaz Betts, who's Chad Gable in WWE, was on our show, and the list goes on and on. So super proud of that library list of people that we had on the show.
Yeah, and if you like what Kyle and I do, he's got On the Mat with Andy Hamilton, Andy, and with Track Wrestling, they have some other programs on the network here, and then of course the Short Time Wrestling Podcast, and Short Time Shots, which is released semi-frequently during the week, depending on the number of scores that are out there. You can contribute to this by going to MattTalkOnline.com/join-the-team. Keeps the funds down and the lights on and all sorts of things. Kyle, I really appreciate the time, and we go through some great moments and some not so great moments from 2008, 2009, Wrestling 411, the first national wrestling podcast. And wow, just a lot of stuff to digest.
Thanks, man. It went so fast. I don't know how we got so much in such a little bit of time, but thanks for letting me reminisce. It's cathartic, it's therapeutic, and thanks for giving me this platform, this opportunity to talk about that year.
The Short Time Wrestling Podcast is proudly outfitted by Compound Clothing. Shirts, singlets, custom gear orders, everything you need. Call up Cliff and the crew at cmpteamwear.com. First time listening? Well, you can change that by going to MattTalkOnline.com/GetShortTime to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or listen on your favorite podcatcher at MattTalkOnline.com/listen.
This show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to MattTalkOnline.com.